Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Alex, an engineer at Airbyte, and I'm here to share with you a demo of our new connector builder. So you'll get a chance to see just how easy it will soon be to implement a connector for a REST API. And this is not an exaggeration. It will really only take a few minutes. As you're probably aware, Airbyte is a data movement tool which already supports over 300 connectors out of the box. And we also empower our users to easily build or customize connectors for use cases that are not readily available. And this is really important because missing a connector that's needed for your data stack means that in addition to paying for your data movement vendor, you'll also need to either invest time and money to build and maintain a custom connector in-house, or you'll have to give up on using the data to make business decisions. And this is a very common problem to face because the landscape of APIs, file systems, and databases that contain valuable data grows exponentially year over year, and no ETL vendor is actually able to keep up with this pace. Now at Airbyte, we don't want this situation to happen, so we support the long tail of connectors by providing everyone with tools that make it easy and fast to build new high-quality connectors. How are we doing this? Well, we implemented a lot of connectors using our connector development kit over the last 2 years. And in doing so, we've made a few key learnings which directed the evolution of our tooling. The first one is that API sources make up 90% of our source connectors. And the second one is that there's a very repeatable pattern to implementing those types of integrations. We'll always go through the same steps of configuring the HTTP request to send, defining how to parse the response, implementing pagination to get all the records, and selecting the cursor field for incremental syncs. And the key here is that each of those problems only have a finite number of solutions. So we've abstracted away all of the complexity and designed configurable off-the-shelf components that can be reused by the connector developers. And what this does is it turns the problem of integrating with a new REST API from an engineering problem into a matter of understanding and translating the API documentation into a YAML file that describes the connector. And this allows the developers to really focus on the specifics of their integrations. Now, of course, we're aware that writing a large YAML file is a very tedious task, which is where the connector builder comes into play. So we'll now walk through just how easy it actually is to implement a connector from scratch. We're now in the onboarding flow of the connector builder. For the purpose of this demo, let's pretend that we're a marketer and that we want to pull data from the post-hug API for product analytics. The connector for that integration might not already exist, but thankfully, it's a very simple process to create one from scratch. So we can just dive right into it and set an icon and a name, as well as the URL of the API. And we can now start thinking about how to configure our first stream. So a stream is Airbyte's terminology to represent either a database table or an API endpoint. It's essentially a collection of homogeneous records. And for now, let's start by integrating with the cohorts endpoint, which returns events aggregated by users. And the path to the endpoint is projects, projects ID, cohorts. And the project ID represents the ID of the project that we want to pull data for. So it is going to depend on the ID of the user's project. So we'll have to create a new user input here that we will call project ID. It's going to be a string and it's going to be required because we need to know what project to pull data for. And we can also add hints and placeholders to help the users know how to configure the field. And as you can see, what this does is it will parameterize the path of the endpoint so that we always pull the data for the right project. We can now set the name of our stream, cohorts, and configure the authentication. In the case of post-hug, we'll want to use a bearer token. And now before we can actually test the connector, we need to set our user input. So I will input my API key as well as my project ID. And I can now click test read. And what this will do is it will submit requests to the endpoint and turn the response into records that can be emitted or synced to whatever destination you want. Now, what is interesting here is that only one record was produced. And the reason why is that by default, the connector builder will interpret the full body of the response as being the records that we want to sync. And if we look at the response here, we can see that this is not quite what we want. We can see that there's a few metadata fields here, such as the count, next, previous. And then there's a results field here, which is an array whose items are actually the records that we care about. We can see here just the ID, the name. So what we'll want to do is set the record selector to this result field so that we know to extract the records from this one specific field. And we can also set the primary key to this ID field here to give our records a primary key. So that's what we're going to do. Set the primary key to ID and the record selector to results. So if we click test rate again, we see that we now extracted 100 records from that response. Now, that is still not all the records that we would expect because the post-hug API is paginated. So we'll have to submit more than a single request to get all the records that we need. So we will configure the pagination. The way pagination works on post-hug is using an offset increment, which can be configured through request parameters. So we will set an offset request parameter, which specifies the offset to request the data from. And we will set a limit request parameter, which represents the number of records that should be in each pages or in each request, in each response received. So if we click test read again, we should see that we now have 190 records in pages of 10 records. We can update the page size to 20 if we want. We'll still retrieve 190 records, but in pages of 20. So this is really all we need to implement a simple stream. So we can now implement a second one. Let's say that we now want to integrate with the events stream, which is at /projects project ID events. We'll use the same user input that we already created here, project ID, and we will finish writing up the path here. So if we click create, we've now created a new stream and that we will configure very similarly to the cohort stream. But instead of configuring the pagination from scratch, we'll just import the paginator from the previous stream. And we can now click test read to read data from the events endpoint. And that's it. We've now implemented a second stream. We can do a third one just for fun, but this time, instead of creating it from scratch, what we'll do is we will duplicate this event stream. And let's say that we want to integrate with the groups stream, groups endpoint this time. So we'll name our stream groups and we'll update the path. And this will create a new stream that is already configured just the way we want. We can click test read. And that's all we need to read data from this groups endpoint. So we've now implemented a connector with 3 streams. We can export it into our platform and sync the data into a Snowflake table. So if we now go to our platform, you will see this post-hug demo connector, which is the one that we just created. And we can connect it to our Snowflake destination. We will run the sync manually, and we will sync the 3 streams that we just created. So let's set up this connection and sync now. And we're back. And as you can see, our sync succeeded. So if we take a quick peek at our Snowflake warehouse, we can see that the data has been successfully pulled and synced into our table. So we've done it. We were able to successfully create a new connector from scratch. So as you can see, Airbyte's new connector builder makes it incredibly easy to create a new API source connector. We're very excited to announce the early access program for the builder, and we invite you to join the waitlist using the QR code just here. Thank you very much for listening.